Remember those moments when you were a kid and had to face that one food you just couldn't stand? Well, even presidents, with their lavish menus, had their own food dislikes. Stick around, because we're diving into the quirks of presidential palates, complete with some surprising revelations. George Washington, turnips. Imagine being the first president of the United States and still dealing with food you couldn't stand. For George Washington, it was turnips that always ended up at the bottom of his list. His staff would try to sneak them into meals, highlighting their health benefits, but Washington remained firm in his distaste. Even with his wisdom and leadership, he just couldn't tolerate the earthy flavor of turnips. Doesn't that remind you of those veggies you hated as a kid? It's funny to think that even someone like Washington had food battles, just like the rest of us. But when you're the president, you can simply refuse without consequence. Imagine being served something you despise at every meal. Would you put up with it or send it back? And what about John Adams? His least favorite food might surprise you, and it involves something much more common. Keep watching to find out. John Adams, tea. As the second president of the United States, John Adams left a legacy filled with political achievements, but when it came to tea, he wasn't a fan. Adams famously disliked the drink, which is ironic given his key role in the Boston Tea Party, one of the most famous protests against tea in history. Instead, Adams preferred his beverages strong, like a cup of black coffee or a glass of whiskey, steering clear of the delicate flavors associated with tea. Isn't it funny to think how different our country's traditions might have been if the man who helped shape the nation had embraced tea culture? Can you imagine John Adams sipping tea while making some of the biggest decisions in American history? Curious about what Thomas Jefferson couldn't stand? If you've ever thought some foods were too spicy, you'll definitely relate to this one. Stick around. Jefferson's food aversion will surprise you. Thomas Jefferson. Spicy foods. Thomas Jefferson, a man renowned for his love of French cuisine and culinary curiosity, had one surprising weak spot: spicy food. Despite his global travels and appreciation for sophisticated flavors, even the mildest hint of heat was enough to turn him away. Spices like pepper were his worst nightmare, and Jefferson preferred his meals mild and gentle on the tongue. I have to say, I understand the struggle. Spicy food was my nemesis growing up too. Just the thought of it made me anxious. It's somehow comforting to know that even a brilliant mind like Jefferson's couldn't overcome his aversion to spicy foods. If you've ever avoided adding that extra dash of pepper to your meal, you're not alone. But who else shared this anti-spice sentiment? James Madison, surprisingly. Stick around to hear why Madison also steered clear of the spice cabinet. There's more to come in this flavor-shy presidential club. James Madison, spices and seasoning. James Madison, much like Thomas Jefferson, had a preference for milder flavors. But Madison went even further, avoiding not just spicy foods, but almost all seasoning. His meals were known to be simple, plain, and devoid of the rich flavors that many presidents before and after him enjoyed. Madison's tastes may have been unexciting, but they likely matched his calm, pragmatic approach to leadership. Imagine having access to the finest chefs in the White House, yet sticking to bland, unseasoned meals. It's almost hard to believe, but maybe this simplicity reflected Madison's steady demeanor, focused on the essentials without the frills. Do you ever find yourself preferring a simpler meal over something bold? Madison certainly did, but not every president followed his lead. Next, we'll explore James Monroe's strong aversion to oysters, a dislike that stands out, especially given his coastal connections. James Monroe, oysters. James Monroe's aversion to seafood, especially oysters, stood out, particularly during a time when coastal delicacies were in high demand. Despite their popularity among his peers, Monroe just couldn't handle the texture or taste. As the fifth president, leading the nation through a period of expansion, his dislike for oysters is a small but fascinating detail in his otherwise historic legacy. I've been on the fence about oysters myself. Trying them for the first time, I remember thinking, what's all the fuss about? It's comforting to know that even a president shared that same sentiment. Monroe's avoidance of oysters adds a personal touch to his otherwise strong leadership. If you think Monroe's seafood aversion was unique, just wait until you hear about John Quincy Adams and his serious dislike for mushrooms. Have you ever disliked a food everyone else seemed to love? Let us know in the comments. John Quincy Adams, mushrooms. John Quincy Adams, the son of President John Adams, had no love for mushrooms. Whether sautéed, grilled, or added to a steak, mushrooms were always swiftly removed from his plate. Despite their versatility in countless dishes, the earthy flavor and chewy texture were not something Adams ever warmed up to. I've always found mushrooms to be an acquired taste. Like Adams, I wasn't a fan at first either, but over time, they've grown on me. Imagine being president and having the luxury of dismissing them from your meals entirely. Adams certainly made use of that privilege. Curious about what Andrew Jackson couldn't stand. Let's just say anything too fancy wasn't his style. Have you ever had a food you couldn't tolerate no matter how it was prepared? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Andrew Jackson, fancy European cuisine. Andrew Jackson, known as the man of the people, had little tolerance for the extravagant European cuisine served at the White House during his presidency. Jackson was all about simplicity, often opting for hearty meals like steak and eggs over the elaborate foreign dishes favored by the elite. His distaste for fancy food mirrored his straightforward leadership style, valuing substance over show. I can totally relate. There are times when a simple, comforting meal is way more satisfying than anything complicated. I've definitely had moments where, surrounded by gourmet choices, all I wanted was something basic and familiar. Ever felt the same? What's the simplest meal you've craved in a fancy setting? Share your stories in the comments below. William Henry Harrison, luxurious foods. Could you live without luxurious meals like William Henry Harrison? Harrison found rich, luxurious food overly complicated and unnecessary. He preferred simple, straightforward meals that reflected his down-to-earth personality. To him, fancy dishes were more about show than flavor, and he rejected the idea that extravagance was needed for a satisfying meal. It's interesting how someone in such a prestigious position would choose to turn away from the indulgence that came with it. I can't help but think about times when I've chosen simplicity over something more elaborate. Sometimes a home-cooked meal hits the spot in a way no gourmet dish can. Have you ever felt that less is more when it comes to food? And speaking of simplicity, the next president agrees with Harrison, but for a different reason. John Tyler had his own issue with overly greasy foods. Curious to find out more? Let's continue. John Tyler, greasy and rich foods. Ever feel bloated after a rich meal? John Tyler could relate. Tyler made it clear that he couldn't tolerate greasy, heavy foods. He preferred lighter, simpler meals, avoiding anything that left him feeling uncomfortably full or sluggish. In a time when the White House served decadent dishes, Tyler stood out for his preference for balance and moderation in his diet. I've definitely had those moments after a meal where I regretted indulging in something too rich. Tyler's approach makes me think about how important it is to know your limits, even when you have access to the best of the best. Do you avoid heavy foods too? Or do you think indulgence is part of the experience? Next, let's look at Woodrow Wilson's dislike for chicken liver. It might not be what you expect from a president. Woodrow Wilson, chicken liver. Have you ever encountered a dish that you just couldn't stand? For Woodrow Wilson, it was chicken liver. Despite attending countless state dinners with elaborate menus, Wilson always avoided this particular delicacy. He found the texture too gritty and the taste too strong for his liking. Even with some of the best chefs at his disposal, chicken liver was never on his plate. I remember being a kid and cringing at certain textures in food. There's just something about liver that divides people. It's fascinating to think that even someone with access to gourmet meals like Wilson had strong aversions to specific dishes. What about you? Is there a food you absolutely avoid, no matter how it's prepared? Next up, we'll dive into a more controversial food dislike. Franklin D. Roosevelt, asparagus. Did you know that even Franklin D. Roosevelt had food preferences and asparagus was at the top of his no-thank-you list? Despite enjoying a variety of meals, FDR simply couldn't stand the taste of asparagus. Eleanor Roosevelt, ever the attentive hostess, made sure this particular vegetable never graced the menu at state dinners. I can definitely relate. There's something about asparagus that divides people. For some, it's a delicacy, but for others, like FDR, it's a definite pass. It's always interesting to see how even the most powerful figures have their quirky dislikes. Do you have a food you can't tolerate, even when it's considered a delicacy by others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Next up, we'll uncover another surprising dislike from a different president. Stay tuned to find out what Harry Truman had a strong distaste for. Harry S. Truman, broccoli. Broccoli has long divided households, and Harry S. Truman was no exception. Truman couldn't get past the texture or taste of this healthy green vegetable, much like several other presidents before and after him. He preferred heartier, simpler vegetables like potatoes and corn, which better suited his Midwestern tastes. I remember growing up with the same distaste for broccoli, always pushing it to the side of my plate. It's funny how even a president had that same aversion. It just goes to show that no matter your status, Some foods are hard to swallow. Do you share Truman's dislike for broccoli, or is it a favorite on your table? Let me know in the comments. Gerald Ford, liver and onions. Gerald Ford, the 38th President of the United States, had a strong aversion to liver and onions, a dish that was quite popular in many American households at the time. Despite its reputation as a nutritious meal, liver and onions never appealed to Ford's palate. He found the texture of liver too grainy and the flavor overpowering, even when paired with the sweetness of onions. For Ford, simple meals were more appealing, and liver simply didn't make the cut. I can remember being served liver and onions as a child, and dreading every bite, so I can completely relate to Ford's distaste. There's something about the metallic taste of liver that just doesn't sit right with some people, even those in the highest office in the land. Do you think you would have turned down this dish like Ford did? Or is liver and onions a nostalgic favorite for you? Let me know in the comments below. Next up, John Quincy Adams, who surprisingly wasn't a fan of ice cream. John Quincy Adams, ice cream. John Quincy Adams, the 6th president, was a man of refined tastes, but ice cream wasn't one of them. While ice cream was already a popular treat by his time, Adams found it far too sweet for his liking. Though many people in America were developing a taste for this cool dessert, Adams often passed it by at state dinners and social gatherings, preferring simpler fare. For him, the cloying sweetness of ice cream overwhelmed the palate, making it something he avoided when given the choice. I remember the excitement of ice cream on a hot day as a kid, but for Adams, it seems the allure of sugar-coated treats was lost. It's curious to think that a man who was known for his intellectual prowess wasn't drawn to something as universally beloved as ice cream. What about you? Could you imagine life without ice cream? Or do you think Adams missed out on one of life's simple joys? John Tyler, fancy pastries. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, was known for his straightforward tastes, preferring simple and hearty meals over anything extravagant. One thing Tyler particularly avoided was fancy, elaborate pastries. During his presidency, the White House often served intricate desserts at state functions, but Tyler was unimpressed. The sugary, rich pastries, often filled with creams and topped with delicate decorations, were far too sweet and indulgent for his palate. I've always thought there was something nostalgic about a well-made pastry, but Tyler's simplicity in food choices shows that even the most extravagant meals aren't for everyone. It's refreshing to know that a president could hold firm to his humble preferences, even when surrounded by gourmet options. Do you agree with Tyler's taste for the simpler things in life, or do you find yourself reaching for that delicate eclair or croissant? Let me know in the comments. And speaking of simple tastes, Ulysses S. Grant had an aversion to fish. Find out why next. Ulysses S. Grant. Fish. Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general who helped lead the Union to victory in the Civil War, had a strong dislike for fish. Whether it was the texture or the strong flavors, Grant never developed a taste for seafood. He made a point to avoid fish during meals, favoring hearty meats like beef or pork instead. Grant's diet was reflective of his straightforward, no-nonsense personality. He preferred meals that were filling and uncomplicated. I can relate to Grant's distaste for fish. Growing up, fish was always the food I dreaded seeing on the dinner table, and it seems Grant shared a similar sentiment. While fish is often seen as a delicacy, it's not for everyone, and Grant was one of those who opted for land-based protein instead. What about you? Are you team fish, or would you have skipped it like Grant? Let me know in the comments. Next up, Lyndon B. Johnson's surprising dislike for cottage cheese. Lyndon B. Johnson, cottage cheese. Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ as he was commonly known, had one specific food that he truly couldn't stand: cottage cheese. The 36th president, known for his Texan tastes and love of barbecue, found the texture of cottage cheese too strange for his liking. Even though cottage cheese was often recommended as a healthy food option, LBJ steered clear of it throughout his presidency, preferring heartier, more flavorful foods that reminded him of home. I've always had mixed feelings about cottage cheese. Sometimes it's the perfect snack, and other times the texture can be off-putting. For LBJ, the latter always won out, and he made sure it never made an appearance on his plate. Do you share LBJ's distaste for this popular dairy dish? Or is it one of your go-to snacks? Let me know in the comments. Up next, we'll dive into James Buchanan's aversion to carrots. Yes, even carrots couldn't win him over. James Buchanan, carrots. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, had a rather surprising dislike for a vegetable many consider a staple: carrots. Despite their nutritional benefits and versatility, Buchanan never developed a taste for this humble root vegetable. He found carrots to be bland and unappealing, preferring more flavorful options like peas and corn at his meals. I can understand Buchanan's aversion. Growing up, I never fully appreciated carrots either. They always felt like the obligatory vegetable that was just there. Yet, while most of us grew to enjoy them, Buchanan firmly kept them off his plate. Do you share Buchanan's view on carrots, or have they become a favorite of yours over time? Let me know in the comments. Chester A. Arthur, cauliflower. Chester A. Arthur, the 21st president, had a particular dislike for cauliflower. While many presidents had their aversions, Arthur found this vegetable to be too bland and often avoided it during meals. Cauliflower, with its mild flavor, didn't appeal to Arthur's taste for more robust foods, and it never found a place on his White House menu. I've always thought cauliflower was a versatile vegetable, but not everyone agrees. Arthur's preference for heartier and more flavorful dishes meant that this simple veggie just didn't cut it for him. How about you? Have you embraced cauliflower as part of your diet? Or do you side with Arthur in thinking it's just too bland? Let me know in the comments. Up next, James K. Polk's surprising distaste for cabbage, boiled cabbage in particular. James K. Polk, cabbage. James K. Polk, the 11th President of the United States, had a strong aversion to cabbage, particularly when it was boiled. The smell alone was enough to turn Polk away from the dinner table. Despite its popularity in many American households, Polk couldn't stand the taste or texture of this cruciferous vegetable, making it a regular absence at his meals. Boiled cabbage is a dish that can be polarizing. I remember the strong, lingering smell from childhood dinners, and I completely understand Polk's reaction. It's funny to think that even a president could share such a common aversion. What about you? Do you enjoy cabbage, or are you with Polk on this one? Let me know in the comments. Calvin Coolidge, sweet potatoes. Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, was known for his simple tastes, and one food he could never get behind was sweet potatoes. Despite their popularity during holidays and family meals, Coolidge found them too sweet for his liking. He preferred more savory vegetables and often opted for plain potatoes over their sugary counterpart. I can see where Coolidge was coming from. Sweet potatoes can sometimes feel more like dessert than a side dish, especially when topped with marshmallows during Thanksgiving. It's interesting to think that even a president had preferences that many of us can relate to. What about you? Are sweet potatoes a staple on your dinner table? Or do you agree with Coolidge that they're just too sweet? Let me know in the comments. Which presidential food aversion surprised you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Enjoyed this historical deep dive? Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for our next surprising revelation about presidential tastes.